No child should see these red flags in their mother. We're biologically wired to believe that a mother is a child's safest harbor. It's the ultimate human trust. But what happens when that harbor is actually a prison? Today, we're looking at the motherhood paradox, the chilling phenomenon where a caregiver becomes a predator, the unthinkable. I'm going to compare the psychological profiles of two mothers who had severe red flags, who used love to hide the unthinkable control. Dee Dee Blanchard and Lacey Spears. There are chilling reports from family members that Dee Dee may have played a role in her own mother's death by withholding food and essential medication. As a licensed professional counselor, this is an obvious major red flag. If these allegations are true, we're looking at a complete severing of the empathy bond. In a healthy psyche, there is a biological break, if you will, that prevents us from harming those who cared for us. In Dee Dee, that break appears to have been absent. She wasn't just neglectful. She was experimenting with the power of life and death through passive aggression, the act of doing nothing to cause a catastrophic result. Her history is littered with check fraud, stealing from her own family, and even reports of writing bad checks to neighbors. We often dismiss fraud as just a money thing, but in the context of the motherhood paradox, this was a dry run for manipulation. Every forged signature was a test. Can I make people believe in my version of reality? She was learning how to exploit the trust of her inner circle, and it worked. By the time Gypsy was born, Dee Dee had already mastered the art of the sincere liar, someone who could look you straight in the eye, break a fundamental rule, and lie through their teeth, and even making you feel like the bad guy for even questioning her. When I analyze this blueprint, I see a personality that views people as a utility, not humanity. Her mother was an obstacle, so she was allegedly removed. No longer the obstacle. Money was a need, so it was taken. And this is the foundation of malignant narcissism. By the time she began to claim Gypsy had sleep apnea or leukemia, she wasn't entering a new phase of life. She was simply applying a proven, successful strategy of manipulation to a new, much more profitable subject. She gained a lot of experience by the time Gypsy was born. While Dee Dee was operating in the shadows of family secrets and small-town fraud, Lacey Spears was taking a completely different path, one that used the captivated audience of the internet to achieve the same chilling result. Lacey's deception wasn't really about stealing. It was more about consuming attention. She learned early on that the one in crisis was her most powerful social currency. She wasn't just lying for profit. She was lying for a fix of empathy from others. It was her drug of choice. If Dee Dee's pathology was built on control, Lacey's was built on visibility. Long before she was known as Garnett's mommy on social media, Lacey was refining a very specific social strategy called the crisis identity. Friends and former coworkers from Lacey's past often described a woman who was always at the center of a storm, always a crisis, always something urgent. She would exaggerate personal stories, create elaborate stories of health scares, or event drama that required immediate emotional support and immediate attention. As a counselor, I look at this and I see a profound void of self-worth. For Lacey, being wasn't enough. She had to be noticed. She learned early on that vulnerability is a form of power. When you're the one in the crisis, you're the one who's in control of the room. You become the protagonist of every single conversation. She wasn't just lying for fun, though. She was using these stories as a fix to regulate her own unstable sense of self. Lacey didn't just want money, although she took it. She wanted to look in people's eyes when they felt sorry for her. She was a consumer of other people's compassion. This is a key marker of histrionic and narcissistic traits. Most of us feel a sense of guilt when people worry about us. Lacey felt a sense of triumph. Every "I'm so sorry" or "how do you do it," she received it like she was the hit of a drug. She was effectively farming empathy. And by the time Garnett was born, she had already discovered that the more tragic the story, the more pure the validation. She didn't just want to be a mother. She wanted to be a martyr. Lacey was an early adopter of the mommy blog. You remember those, right? And social media was the tool that she used for her deception. She magnified it, got lots of attention. And in my practice, I often talk about how social media can be a pathological amplifier. For Lacey, the internet was an ultimate mirror. It allowed her to curate a version of motherhood that was entirely focused on her struggle. She didn't just have a sick child. She had a digital audience to witness her performance of the perfect caregiver. This is where the motherhood paradox becomes truly modern. The mask isn't just for the neighbors anymore. It's for the entire world. It's for anyone that would pay attention to her tragedy. When we look at these two side by side, we see two different ways of breaking the same biological bond. Dee Dee wanted a slave to serve her need for control. Lacey wanted a prop to serve her need for applause. But for both mothers, the child was never seen as a human being, only as a tool to maintain the motherhood paradox. This is the exact moment where the developmental blueprint we just discussed meets the vulnerable subject. In mental health, we look at the catalyst, which is the event that turns a personality disorder into a predatory pattern. For Dee Dee and Lacey, that catalyst was the birth of their children. As a therapist, I often talk about the power dynamic in relationships, but the mother-child bond is the most lopsided power dynamic in existence. A newborn has zero autonomy, zero voice, and a total biological dependency. They cry for needs. They cry to be fed. They cry to be changed. They cry to have comfort from their mother. And for a person with a pathological need for control or validation, a child isn't just a person. They are the ultimate captive audience. When Gypsy and Garnett were born, the switch flipped. These women realized they no longer had to con peers or family members who might eventually see through their lies. They now had a human being that they could mold, define, and narrate from day one. There is a psychological phenomenon that I call the institutional deference. It's a societal blind spot that acts as a shield of sanctity for certain predators. We're socially conditioned to view the mother-child bond as the most sacred, selfless relationship in human existence. Because of this, when a mother speaks about her child's health or behavior, her word is effectively law. I've seen this play out in the clinical settings where doctors and teachers, even law enforcement, subconsciously defer to the mother's narrative without the usual level of scrutiny. They aren't being negligent. They're following a social script that says a mother would never lie about her child's suffering. But for the perpetrator with the profile that we're discussing here, this isn't just a social norm. It's a tactical advantage. They don't just hide behind the mother's law, they weaponize it. They use that institutional trust to isolate the child, gaslight the other parent, and silence any outside concerns. When the law of the mother is used as a weapon, the victim is left in a psychological vacuum where no one, not even the authorities, will believe their reality over the mother's expert testimony. This is exactly why the judge was so shaken during the trial. He realized he wasn't just looking at a case of control. He was looking at someone who had successfully hijacked our most fundamental social trust to facilitate a worst-case scenario. Wow. Dee Dee Blanchard and Lacey Spears didn't just step into a role of motherhood. They transformed it into a position of absolute gatekeeping. In a healthy dynamic, a mother is a gateway to the world. She prepares the child to eventually leave her. But for these individuals, the role was inverted. They became the only filter through which the world could see the child, and the only filter through which the child could see the world. They flipped it. They realized a dark truth about our society. Motherhood is an unvetted credential. They took advantage of that. If a mother says her child is in pain, the world moves with a sense of urgency to help. We don't ask for a second opinion before offering sympathy. We offer the sympathy first because our motherhood bias tells us that no woman would ever fabricate a child's suffering for her own gain, right? That's how they leverage this. They use it as a tactical shield. The motherhood paradox here is a devastating one. It's the very role designed to be the child's ultimate protection was repurposed into their prison. By assuming the identity of the selfless caregiver, they made themselves untouchable. If you question them, you were the villain attacking a struggling mother. This created a psychological vacuum for the children. They were isolated not by walls, but by their mother's expertise. They were being exploited by the one person the world told them was their only advocate, the best person in the world to care for them. When the person who is supposed to be your shield becomes a sword, there's nowhere left to hide. This isn't just abuse. It's a total hijacking of the most fundamental human bond that we have. While the outcomes for the children were tragically similar, the psychological engines driving these two women were fundamentally different. To understand why a judge would call this the worst, we have to look at the different needs that they were trying to satisfy. For Dee Dee Blanchard, the catalyst was about permanence. In a healthy home, the goal of a mother is to work herself out of a job, to raise a child, to leave and become independent. We want them to leave the nest. But for a pathological profile like Dee Dee's, independence is the enemy. She saw Gypsy as the infinite anchor. The sick child narrative was a way to freeze time. By keeping Gypsy in a wheelchair, on a feeding tube, and developmentally young in the eyes of the world, Dee Dee ensured she would never be alone. An anchor doesn't just stay put, it holds everything else in place. For Dee Dee, Gypsy wasn't a person. She was a guarantee that Dee Dee would always have a purpose and always be in control. For Lacey Spears, the catalyst was about magnification. Lacey didn't want an anchor to stay still. She wanted a lighthouse to draw the world's eyes directly onto her. Garnett was the prop that allowed her to move from small-town drama to a global digital stage. The paradox here is chilling. The more Garnett suffered, the more Lacey's heroism was magnified. Every hospital stay, every dramatic update on social media was a way to turn the spotlight back on herself. She didn't just want a child to care for, she wanted a tragedy to be the star in. While Dee Dee wanted to hide away in her pink house anchor, Lacey wanted the world to watch her struggle. One was driven by fear of being alone, the other was driven by the hunger to be seen. But in both cases, the child was never the priority. They were simply the fuel for the mother's psychological need. When they became mothers, their pre-existing need for control for Dee Dee and attention for Lacey found a perfect vehicle. A child is the ultimate captive audience, and to the outside world, the mother is the one in charge. The moment Gypsy was born, Dee Dee began claiming sleep apnea and other ailments. The paradox was born right then. She protected Gypsy from non-existent illnesses to ensure Gypsy would never leave her. With the birth of Garnett, Lacey's hero narrative went into full overdrive. She didn't just want to be a mother, she wanted to be the ultimate mother of a miracle child who was constantly fighting for her child. This is where the motherhood paradox truly ignites. The biological role of protector becomes the mask for the predator. They use the social halo of motherhood to commit crimes in plain sight. This switch is what makes the motherhood paradox so difficult to catch. To the casual observer, these women looked more devoted, more attentive, and more loving than the average parent because they had a sick child to care for. But when I look at these cases through a clinical lens, I see the truth. They weren't looking at their children. They were looking at what their children could do for them. It's tempting to think that these women just woke up one day and decided to do this. But as we look at their blueprints, we see that the pathology was already in motion long before their children were born. The children didn't cause the behavior. They provided the opportunity for it. To understand how they got away with it for so long, we have to look at the specific red flags that society and even medical professionals simply didn't see. When we look at the motherhood paradox in action, we aren't just seeing a lie. We're seeing a curated reality. Both women built a mask that was so convincing that it acted like a psychological barrier, preventing anyone from seeing the abuse that was happening right in front of them. Lacey didn't just post on the internet, she curated it. She used the mommy vlogging and social media to create a 24/7 documentary of her heroic struggle. As a therapist, I see this as a weaponization of transparency. By sharing so much, she created the illusion that she had nothing to hide. This was the calculated psychological shield that she built. When a mother is crying on camera about her son's mystery illness, our brains are biologically wired to offer support, not scrutiny. She was grooming the collective, training her friends and family and even medical staff to view her as the primary victim. In her mind, the digital applause she received wasn't just validation. It was, get this, permission to continue. She used the internet to build a good mother firewall. Every like, every stay strong comment reinforced the mask, making it almost impossible for anyone to ask, wait a minute here, why is he only getting sick when you're alone with him? Dee Dee used physical alterations, shaving Gypsy's head, using a wheelchair, and even reportedly using numbing agents on Gypsy's gums to simulate drooling. That's diabolical. While Lacey used the digital world, Dee Dee used an architectural of fragility. She created a visual shortcut for terminal illness. When you see a child who is bald and in a wheelchair, your brain bypasses critical thinking and goes straight to the sympathetic bias. As a therapist, I call this the erasure of the subject. Dee Dee didn't see Gypsy. She saw the prop of illness. By physically manifesting the illness, she made the lie visible. It's much harder for a doctor to trust a lab result that says healthy when their eyes are telling them the child is dying. She leaned into the self-sacrificing mother archetype so heavily that she made the truth feel like an insult to the motherhood itself. Dee Dee understood very quickly that humans believe what they see more than what they know. She didn't just lie with her words, she lied with Gypsy's body. Look, she's sick, she's bald, she's in a wheelchair, she's in the hospital. She turned a healthy child into a living, breathing red flag that everyone was too polite to acknowledge. The common thread here is the subversion of the caregiver role. Lacey's mask was built on publicity. She needed the world to watch her suffer. Dee Dee's mask was built on proximity. She needed total isolated control over Gypsy's physical reality. But in both cases, the mask served the same clinical purpose. It turned a child's suffering into the mother's glory. This is the darkest corner of the motherhood paradox, where the mask becomes more important to the mother than the life of the child. Unimaginable. To the outside world, doctors are the ultimate authority. But in the hands of a pathological caregiver, the medical professional is just another prop to be managed. This is where the motherhood paradox enters the clinical space through a tactic that I call the expert trap. When a specialist began to ask too many questions or the lab result didn't match the mother's story, both Dee Dee and Lacey would abruptly fire the doctor and then move to a new hospital or even to a new state. In my practice, I value the long-term therapeutic relationship because it provides a baseline of truth and trust. Dee Dee and Lacey did the exact opposite. They practiced deliberate fragmentation. By constantly switching providers, they ensured that no single professional had the full blueprint of their child. They weren't looking for a cure, they were looking for a blank slate. Each new doctor was a fresh audience who hadn't yet seen through the performance. They used a psychological technique called information asymmetry. Because they were with the child 24/7, they positioned themselves as the only true experts on the child's symptoms. They would describe seizures or episodes that only happened when no one else was looking. As a therapist, I see this as subversion of the healing bond. They forced the doctors to rely on the mother's report over their own clinical observations. If the doctors challenged them, the mothers would weaponize their devotion, making the doctor feel like they were attacking a grieving parent rather than questioning a medical fact. They turned it around, they personalized it. That was their tactic. This is perhaps the most tragic part of the pathology. By manipulating doctors and performing unnecessary surgeries or prescribing toxic levels of medication, like the salt poisoning in Garnett's case, these women turn healers into unwitting accomplices. From a clinical lens, this is a form of proximal abuse. They didn't strike the child themselves. They manipulated the system to do the harming for them. It allowed the mothers to keep their hands clean and maintain their hero persona while the medical system provided the physical proof of the child's suffering. They didn't just break the law, they broke the sacred trust between a parent and a provider and a child. The expert trap works because the system is built on the assumption of good faith. Doctors are trained to believe parents, and society is trained to believe mothers. Dee Dee and Lacey didn't just lie, they exploited the empathy reflex of the medical community. They knew that a doctor's desire to help a suffering mother would often override their professional suspicion. When the mask is finally pulled away by the legal system, we don't always see a confession. Instead, we often see a pathological pivot. The trial becomes the final stage for their hero or victim narrative. During her trial for the murder of Garnett, Lacey often appeared detached, stoic, or even mildly offended. She didn't just break down, she maintained a posture of a mother who was being persecuted for her devotion. As a counselor, I recognize this as defensive narcissism. Lacey couldn't admit the harm that she caused because in her mind, the heroic caregiver was the only identity that gave her life meaning. To admit guilt would be to commit pathological death, the total collapse of the self-image that she had spent a lifetime building. Her demeanor wasn't just bravery. It was a desperate attempt to protect her ego from the truth. She was still trying to win the room by being the most misunderstood person in it. Even though Dee Dee was dead, her presence dominated Gypsy Rose's legal proceedings. The trial wasn't just about a crime, It was about the residual trauma of the paradox. Dee Dee wasn't in the courtroom, but her psychological blueprint was everywhere. Gypsy's case presented a unique challenge for the law. How do you judge a person who has lived their entire life inside someone else's lie? As a therapist, I see this as the ultimate tragedy of the motherhood paradox. The abuse doesn't end with the perpetrator's death. It leaves the survivor with a no man's land of autonomy. Gypsy had been trained to be the victim for so long that her survival, the very act of ending the abuse, was viewed through a lens of criminality. The mother's mask was so strong it actually criminalized the victim's escape. When we compare these two outcomes, we see the true power of the motherhood paradox. Lacey used the trial to try and reestablish her mask, while Dee Dee's mask was so thick it continued to haunt her daughter from the grave. In both of these cases, the truth wasn't a relief. It was a violent collision with a curated fantasy. As a therapist, this tells me that the pathology isn't just about the lie. It's about the total rejection of reality. Lacey used the digital world to curate her mask, but Dee Dee's control was much more intimate and physical. However, both strategies led to the same clinical outcome, the total erasure of the child's autonomy. Whether it was through a blog post or a feeding tube, the goal was the same: to ensure the child remained a prop in the mother's narrative. We looked at the blueprints and the active crimes, but the most important question for us is the answer: how did the world let this happen? The answer is not as easy as it seems. It lies in our own psychological blind spots. As we look at these two cases, the biggest takeaway isn't just about the pathology of these two women. It's about the psychological phenomenon called the halo effect. This is a cognitive bias where our overall impression of a person, in this case, as a devoted mother, influences how we feel and think about their character as a whole. Because society views motherhood as an inherently sacred, and we should, it is a sacred bond, we project the goodness onto every action that they take. We also have to realize that a title, whether it's a mother, a doctor, or a leader, isn't a guarantee of character. The motherhood paradox thrives in the silence of our own discomfort. We're often afraid to speak up because we don't want to be wrong about someone we've put on a pedestal. We chose the comfort of the halo over the messy reality of the red flags. In my practice, I often tell people, trust the patterns, not the performance. A performance is what someone wants you to see. A pattern is what they actually do over time. In both the Dee Dee Blanchard and the Lacey Spears cases, the patterns of medical inconsistencies and isolations were screaming for attention, but the performance of the doting mother was even louder. Prevention starts when we value the safety of the vulnerable and the social comfort of the caregiver. It means building a culture of inquiry where asking a difficult question isn't seen as an attack, but as an act of protection. Whether you're a neighbor, a teacher, or a professional, your gut feeling is often your subconscious picking up on a pattern that the halo effect is trying to hide. Don't ignore the pattern just because the performance is beautiful. Obviously, these cases are extreme, but the psychological drivers behind them, the need for validation, the desire for control, and the use of the mask, aren't as rare as we like to think. We live in an era where performing our lives has become the norm. This is a really shocking case because it involves a mother and a child. We think of our own mothers. Some of you had great mothers and a great childhood, and you still have a strong bond with them. Your childhood was great. You have a lot of fond memories. Others of you, maybe your childhood was terrible. You have horrible memories with your mother. It is tragic when these red flags come out in this situation. After seeing how these two mothers manipulated the world around them by using the perfect narrative, Do you think our society has become better at spotting the red flags? Or have we just given the mask a new, more digital place to hide? No child should ever see these red flags.